Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. So on today's episode, I'm going to fill you in a little bit with regard to where I've been, what's been going on with me, why there was such a big hiatus this past year in 2022. And also, I'm going to talk a bit about an article that I read in The Guardian and that I very much agree with about the quote-unquote sad beige trend for children. So stick around. So yeah, just to give you guys a heads up, I am feeling okay. I'm not sick or anything, but I literally scalded the roof of my mouth all the way back to my throat, which is horrible. But I had made like a veggie pizza and I had all the vegetables on top and they were really hot. And when I put the piece in my mouth, you know how sometimes when you put something really hot in your mouth and your body responds by not knowing what to do, really. So you try to spit it out, but you try to swallow part of it as well. And you're kind of in this difficult situation because it's so hot. It kind of paralyzes you in that moment. So that's what happened to me, basically. So I ended up burning half of the roof of my mouth, on the left side. And then when I was swallowing the hot vegetables, I ended up scalding my tonsils and stuff as well. So I am a hot mess on the throat and mouth end. So please accept my apologies in advance for any sort of vocal weirdness on this call or this podcast. So that's what happened on that front. But with regard to where I've been, so 2022 was a hard year because I was, we were doing okay in terms of COVID. I was still doing a lot of mutual aid work. I was giving out masks and things like that through social media, mailing stuff and whatnot. And I actually ended up mailing well over 12,000 masks, which is just wild to even think about. Mailed over 12,000 N95s to people in need, just from from my living room, from my house. So it can be done. You can do things individually that help a lot of people. And I encourage those of you who have the means and the time and the energy to really invest in projects like this. If you can't do it yourself, then to donate or support others who are doing it, local as well. If you know community organizations and things like that that are doing things on the ground with people, definitely support them. So shout out to all the folks doing mutual aid. But so in doing that, I felt somewhat like I was doing something with purpose. I was being a mom, obviously. I was still working on my dissertation somewhat, but I feel like my main energies were geared towards really protecting people, because I have a belief that regardless of your income level, you should be able to have the things that you need, the tools that you need to protect yourself in this pandemic, which is ongoing, and that the government has basically abandoned ship on for quite some time, right? 2022 was not unique in that way, but it seems like things had gotten worse. And so my child was going to school. She was 2 at the time. She's about to be 3, but during all of 2022, she's going to school. She's doing okay. Everything's fine. And the school that she was going to, thankfully, they were still taking COVID seriously. All the teachers and the assistant teachers and the admin, everybody was masking. Kids were required to mask. Parents were required to mask on pickup and all this stuff. It was great. I loved it. They required, testing if a kid was showing symptoms and things like that. They were really doing what they needed to do. So I appreciate that. However, they hired a teacher who I guess didn't really think of COVID as a big deal. And she was walking around with the kids without wearing her mask, or she'd have it under her nose or under her chin when I would come and pick my daughter up. And so, I sent the school a letter and I was just like, hey, can you please, or an email, can you please make sure that everybody's masking at school? This is the policy and it's really important because the kids are often indoors when the weather's bad and it could expose the kids to COVID potentially. And then you don't know what people are dealing with in terms of their households. their parents, their siblings, their grandparents, and extended family may be immunocompromised in some way or have issues that make them high risk. So it's really important to like continue to protect the kids and your workers from getting COVID. And basically, they were like, "That's nice, we'll do that." They didn't do anything, and then a week went by. I noticed that when I picked up my daughter again, some of the assistant teachers were not masked, and I said, like, "Can y'all please do something?" Because like it's even though I'm a parent, like, and I'm sending my kid there, it makes things difficult. Like, how am I gonna? I can't enforce anything, right? Like, I can't enforce policy. It's the school's job to enforce the policy. And then literally the day after sending that email, I tested my daughter because I regularly was testing my daughter and ourselves just out of surveillance, because I figured, she's going to school, she's potentially being exposed, and I just want to make sure that she's not positive, because if she's positive, I obviously need to keep her home. I don't want her to make other kids sick, etc., or the teacher sick. So I was regularly testing her. Like every other day, I would test my daughter. And then I tested her one day and she was positive, and it was like bright red positive on the rapid test. And then my husband tested, he was positive. Mine didn't pop positive for several days, but like I was in the house with them. Obviously, I have a toddler, so I'm caring for my toddler, etc. I'm not going to just like not care for her while she's sick. And I was wearing an N95, but if you're in a house, you're breathing the air, even with all the air purifiers in the world, sometimes it's going to be really difficult to stave off an infection like that that's airborne. So I ended up getting COVID as well. Thankfully, all of us did really, really well during the acute phase. I would not have even known that my daughter was sick. She had a runny nose and a sneeze here and there, but like nothing beyond that. She was herself. She had energy. She was, hyped up, doing all sorts of activities and stuff. She really just was. I mean, I never would have known, and I'm thankful that I tested her regularly, because if I hadn't, like, we wouldn't have known to take the steps that we did to notify the school and things like that. And then my husband and I, we did well, although we did have to get Paxlovid because of our own, quote unquote, pre-existing conditions, right? We have health issues that we wanted to make sure, in combination with COVID, wouldn't make things exponentially worse and get scary. And now, like since then, it's just been a wait to see kind of situation. We're hoping that we do okay from here on out, and we're still doing everything we can to protect ourselves from COVID and also to help other people protect themselves from COVID. But ultimately, it was frustrating and really gutting, because I really appreciated the school, and I enjoyed the programming that they were doing, and I thought they were doing a really good job keeping the kids safe. And, thankfully, my daughter had already gotten one of her Moderna shots, one of two. So I think that helped a lot as well in terms of outcome. And then I had recently gotten like a second booster. This was before the bivalent booster was available. But I had recently gotten a second booster. So in that sense, we were well vaccinated and protected, at least for that, on that front. But also just like, I don't know, you just never know at this point, because long COVID is real, and people who are fine during what we call the acute infection stage, like the middle, once they get sick, they're okay. They do fine. They have a quote unquote mild case, just a little cough here, a little congestion there, whatever. But then, people are dying of heart attacks a month out from COVID, or having blood clots 2 months out from COVID, etc. So these things are scary and very real, and I take it seriously and continue to take it seriously. And so I decided at that point to pull my daughter from school, and I've been homeschooling her ever since then. So she's been at home since we got sick in middle of July. Once she got better, she went back for like 1 week once she recovered, and then I pulled her out of school, because I just said, like, there's no point in continuing this, but we have like the rest of the month that she can like go to school for a couple days, see her friends for the last time and whatever, and then be done. And so basically, like, again, it was one of those like life put on hold moments, right? Because a lot of the plans that I had for what my PhD would look like, what my life would look like, what my career would look like. COVID just like kicked that in the teeth. And so I'm trying to kind of think of different ways to use my skills and my, what I'm working on academically, because right now universities are not safe environments. Many are not taking, I think all at this point, none of them are taking any COVID precautions. And that means that a professor like me who has MS and other health issues would be at risk. And then also even if I were completely healthy, I wouldn't feel comfortable working in an environment like that, because it means that, and once you get COVID, you are technically immunocompromised in a lot of ways. Your immune system may be messed up, your organs may be messed up. And these are things that you can't see, but that when they run the tests and they do a full scan of your body and do all the diagnostic work, they start to see things emerge that, especially upon repeat infection, that could kill you, or that could definitely make your life really difficult, especially in a country like the United States, where very little care is given or attention is paid towards people with chronic illness and disability. So it's not just a you problem, it's a societal and structural and institutional problem that makes it very difficult for people who have disabilities and chronic illness. So for me, I was like, I don't really see myself as having any other choice than to homeschool my child. It's difficult. It's really hard. I'm exhausted every day. Like, I need breaks constantly. And I found myself in a position where I just did not have the energy or the free time to devote to the podcast. And I say that in like complete and utter sincerity. Like, it was very difficult, not only in terms of time, but also just emotionally. Right. And I think that last episode that we did with Brent from Rad Reads really, made me think about a lot of things in terms of like radicalism and ways that I'm applying my ideology and my political stance in life. And, I started just continuing to put my nose to the ground and or nose to the grindstone, they say, right? And doing things for other people, but I wasn't really protecting myself in the sense of like my mental state or my emotional state. I was just working and doing things and, driving around, taking my daughter to school, taking her to this activity, taking that. And when I say activity, like outdoor stuff, masks, etc. But my point is that I was run ragged. And I think, that already made it difficult. But then to get COVID and have to switch gears and homeschool her made it even more difficult to have the free time to do interviews, to schedule interviews, to edit the interviews, to put out the social media stuff, etc. So yeah, that's where I've been. I've been being a parent. I've been being an advocate. I've been working in other ways, but I've just been too busy to get to this. And I made it a goal for myself for this year to reinvest in earnest in this project, because it's important to me. And I understand that it's important to a lot of the listeners. And I recognize that it's something that I need to continue doing, even if I'm tired, even if I don't have energy. But I've made it a point to really make sure that I put out some sort of content. So with all of that said, I think for today, I want to talk a little bit about parenting stuff. So this is going to be a Comrade Mommy episode. So for those of you who don't like the mommy stuff or aren't interested in parenting stuff, feel free to check out of this. But it is something that you might be interested in, because I'm going to talk a bit about consumerism, minimalism, and things like that. And the ideas that are sort of what's considered socially acceptable in terms of child rearing, that's very much rooted in capitalism. And so it might interest you regardless, even if you're not a parent. But I want to talk today about an article that was written by Eva Wiseman in The Guardian. And the title of the article is called "The Quote-Unquote Sad Beige Trend for Kids Goes Against All of My Wild Instincts." So it's an interesting article. I agree with most of the points that she makes, but basically she's talking about this trend that's popped up in the past few years of like very minimalist, very clean, no mess, kids' playrooms, right? So first of all, there's a whole thing where like every kid has to have a playroom, right? Which already says a lot about what type of house you have, what type of income you have, whether or not you have someone to stay at home and watch your kid play in a room like that. It raises all of these questions, right, in terms of class and economic background and access. But then also it talks a bit about this trend and how it's still very much rooted in consumerism, despite it trying to present itself as like a minimalist trend or something that reduces waste or consumption. Because basically what happens is, you have these, like I said, of course, playrooms, right? Sometimes bedrooms, but usually the focus has been in terms of Instagram and Pinterest and things like that on the playroom specifically. And you have like muted colors. So they don't have bright colors. There's not a lot of stuff that's shiny and making noises or lighting up. And some of this is technically rooted in Montessori pedagogy, which at least the application of Montessori in the home, which does emphasize using natural materials and things that are made out of like wood or metal or glass, things that are realistic for kids to play with that are literally items from real life. And then there's also philosophies or like pedagogies like Reggio Emilia, which emphasizes the natural world and things that are found objects in one's community and things like that. So there's a lot of, again, an emphasis on the natural. You're talking about woods and grasses and flowers and things that are, again, like natural, right? But unfortunately, this trend has gone to an extreme where parents are rejecting gifts from people if they have too many colors, or like they're encouraging their kids to be, there's almost like a Victorian aspect of it, of like quiet and calm, and children are to be seen and not heard sort of situation happening in the background. The messaging there at least has that sort of sub message happening. And I think it's interesting because we're entering a point where, consumerism, particularly in the United States, is high, but being challenged by things like inflation. So who has access to goods and who doesn't is becoming very stark. The division is becoming very stark. And so it's fascinating to me to have this idea of like having a child's playroom that basically has no joy or life in it, no color, no fun, but at the same time is rooted in buying things that are very expensive. So the shelves and the toys and everything is like handcrafted and, bespoke and whatever. And even the clothing for kids, everything is organic cotton and free of dyes and chemicals, but then also that seems to mean that it has to be boring in color. And again, it reminds me very much of kind of the Victorian aesthetic, if you think about what was on trend for kids back then. And even if you look at the pictures and whatnot, it's just sort of lifeless and sad. So I'm not saying, my argument is that you don't have to have massive bright colors and lots of noise and things like that for something to be appealing for a child. In fact, in my household, like I said, because we're doing Montessori at home, we don't have a lot of stuff that makes a ton of noise or that lights up and whatnot. We tend to have stuff that she can play with, but that's not going to be, like just making noise, right? Like just kind of like a nuisance, because it's mainly, the main reason that's done is to be able to have the child use their own imagination, right? And like Waldorf philosophy is similar in this sense, where they also encourage kids to use their imagination, so they don't use materials and things like that are from like, that are major commercial products or brands that show, stuff from a kid's show or things that light up or make a bunch of noise. It's all kind of the same basis, which is touching and understanding the real world, touching and understanding, what's natural and knowing the difference between materials, and then also understanding that like there's room there for the kids to use their own imaginations and to apply what they perceive in that moment to whatever they're doing, right? So if my child looks at a block and she calls it cheese, or I don't know, like a bowl or whatever she decides to use it in that moment, that's her using her imagination, which is encouraged, as opposed to like giving her a thing that lights up and like announces itself as what it is, and then your child is like, okay, that's what that is, and that's what they accept it as, so in that sense, good. But I think some of the points of the article were interesting in particular because, when she starts talking about the consumerist aspect of things, and how people have sort of co-opted the idea of what's natural to then mean something that's inaccessible, right? And that's something that we see beyond just the area of like childcare and toys and things like that. When we think about nature in and of itself, right? Like who has access to the wild? who has safety in the wild, who can go out and go on hikes, or go bird watching or whatever, go to the park and not be harassed because of like how they're perceived racially or ethnically, or even in terms of gender, right? Like who can go and safely go to these spaces and not feel intimidated by others or harassed by others in the process. Who has the free time to go to these spaces, who has the access in terms of membership, because some of these, hiking clubs and things like that, some of them have dues and whatnot. So there's all sorts of, there are layers to this, right? In terms of who it's for, but also the question becomes, or the question that in my mind that comes up a lot has to do with like colonialism, right? So you have this embrace of nature by people who are colonizers, but then what does that mean for people for whom the land was, like, to whom the land originally belonged, right? Do indigenous people have access to their land anymore? Or have they, and the answer is yes. They've been forced off their land and into spaces where they don't have as much, they don't have as many natural resources. And the answer there is yes, right? The land that I walk on when I go with my child for a hike is ultimately land that indigenous people were removed from and forced away from and no longer have access to in many ways, at least the original inhabitants, right? And their descendants. Many people were forced out west and elsewhere, and, don't always have access to this land. So it's something to think about, especially with regard to the embrace of the quote unquote natural, but how that comes with a price tag. She also talks a bit about this fear of making a mess, right? And what that means socially as well. She says here, for example, that this beige aesthetic, right, is, quote, an aesthetic that crept in on the back of minimalism, a word which has long made me shudder. To me, the idea of a minimalist home does not suggest its intended serenity or peace. Instead, it suggests fear. Fear both of stains and spillages, but also fear of getting it wrong, of stepping out of line and revealing the dark, grubby truth of one's inner desires, of people thinking you haven't tried hard enough. And I think that's really important because there's so much emphasis right now there's always been, but it's gotten worse over the years with social media and vlogging and things like that, where moms in particular are expected to be perfect, right? Dads can mess up and if we're talking like heterosexual households or like traditional cisgender parenting setups, moms have to be perfect and clean all the time, and the kid has to be clean, and like that playroom has to be perfect, and this and that, and like they always need to be put together. The house needs to be clean too. But then the dad can just like do whatever and like show up and glad he's alive, but like that's pretty much the expectation for him, that he has a pulse. And then the mom is expected to be this like robot, like perfect robot, basically. And so in a lot of ways, this aesthetic, as the author argues, and that I agree with, is it's sort of the aesthetic itself sort of re-emphasizes or reiterates the pressure on moms and parents, and how that starts to sort of spill over into the aesthetic of the household, right? So everything has to be pristine and perfect, even though it's supposed to be natural. But like, it's a very curated form of quote unquote natural, right? It's a very curated form of minimalism that's not born of like the kid just not being interested in that much stuff and using its imagination, and instead is born on like a very manufactured idea of what is supposed to be beautiful and serene and peaceful for the child and the family. The other thing she says also that's great is going further. She says, quote, its exquisite emptiness is still seen as morally superior to a home filled with furniture, let alone mess. And while this sense of moral superiority is nothing new, increasingly it is bolstered by more modern ideas about environmentalism. Stuff, quote unquote, such as raucous plastic toys or piles of felt tips, like markers in England, that's what they call them, becomes proof that their owner doesn't care about the devastation of the planet. And so that's really interesting to me too, because it's taken environmentalism, which was technically, not necessarily a bougie concern back in the day. This idea of caring about the earth and things were like important aspects of Native and Indigenous cultures, and yet and like lifestyle philosophies and politics. And that itself has become co-opted and turned into this upper class concern, right? This upper class thing that you do to raise money and be popular and be, seen as quote unquote environmentalist TM, right? As opposed to something that you do because you actually care about the earth. And that goes beyond just the individual everyday activities that you're doing, but that you understand is a larger structural problem that needs, remedy at the government level, right? It's not just about personal consumer choices. And so I really appreciated that aspect of the article too, and agree with it, because it feels like sometimes the pressure to do less in terms of the home aesthetic actually puts more pressure on you and makes you do more. So in order to keep a room like that clean, you have to work around the clock to put things away, to put stuff back on the shelf, to put things back in bins. Like, your child also has to be sort of supervised in a way that emphasizes basically constant control of their actions, right? At least for the moment that you're going to take a picture. And again, like I said earlier, this goes back to this very social media heavy focus for moms in particular. Again, moms, almost always moms, to have this perfect Instagrammable playroom or Instagrammable bedroom, Pinterest perfect playrooms, the 3Ps, that really get away from a lot of the philosophies that they purport to represent. Because even though these things are in some cases are environmentally friendly, if they go beyond the facade and they're not just looking like they're environmentally friendly, but they are actually environmentally friendly, they are often very expensive. And what you have to do to get the money to afford these things usually is not going to be environmentally positive, right? Like, if your dad or your partner, if your partner is working for a major corporation and that's how you get the money to spend on these like carefully curated items that are environmentally conscious, then are you like, doing one thing with the left hand and another with the right? Like, it kind of makes you ask some questions again about like, well, what is the, like, there's a disconnect there, right? And what good is the environmentally friendly playroom going to be if your partner is like working for a corporation that destroys the forest, So there's a disconnect there. And I think it's important that we think about, other areas that this happens too, not just with regard to the playrooms, but also beauty aesthetics and things like that, and beauty industry, personal fashion, etc. You start to ask questions like, well, am I doing this because I actually care about the environment and that I want to make an impact? Or am I doing this because it's on trend and I'm not really paying attention to that in the other areas of my life, right? And I think too, just on like on like I'm curious about how children see it, right? I'm not a child, so I can't speak for them. And I don't know if a kid would be able to like even articulate what they're thinking about in terms of the color scheme, and how it impacts them. But it raises questions about like, is a child more at peace if they're in a room that's a certain color? Or are they happier if they're in a play area that has minimal toys or minimal things to do in the traditional sense, or minimal colors? And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's some, child psychologists and people who research this that can weigh in. And I think actually some of the origins of it were rooted in that, particularly because apparently children up to a certain age like can't process colors, or at least babies, I should say, not children but babies. So like, I know for babies that are really, really young, they say to show them black and white contrast pictures and like simplified pictures, images, and that their brains can process that better because they don't have fully developed color or depth perception yet. But I don't know about, like, does a toddler need to have a colorless room? Does that matter? And to me, I have a sneaking suspicion that this whole ordeal is like, or trend is something that took an aspect of child psychology, and I certainly see it in the way that it uses Montessori and Waldorf pedagogy in application in the home, and took it too far, right? Like, because I definitely, for example, a good example is that I can speak to is about Montessori, right? So they often say, for Montessori stuff, like you want it to be natural, you want it to be made of natural materials that you can find in nature, and you want the item to be durable. When I say item, I mean like the toys or things that they're playing with. And it's worth noting too that Maria Montessori was practicing in a classroom setting, right? So she's not emphasizing or saying anything necessarily about what you need to be doing at home. But because a lot of people are up, like that are into Montessori in the school setting or also applying some of the principles at home, there's this overlap. But that's not an overlap necessarily that Maria Montessori had like put into word, right? Like there's not like a how to do Montessori at home book by Maria Montessori, because it wasn't an idea at the time. The idea was you do Montessori in the classroom. It was a classroom philosophy. And so my long story short here is like, that being said, you see sometimes that there will be like little play toy cars that are made out of wood. Instead of having a toy car like a Matchbox car that, is metal and then has rubber for the tires, which is very much reflective of an actual car, right? It's just a miniature version of it. Instead of doing that and allowing kids to play with that, they have these cars that are made out of wood, and the wheels are wooden, and it just looks so silly. Like, what are you doing? The natural materials thing is supposed to replicate, to be like a microcosm of real life, and I've never seen a wooden car with wooden wheels, at least not on the street, so like in an effort to kind of sanitize the child's experience, and what they're accessing in terms of toys, they end up doing something that actually goes directly against what happens in real life. I know also there's like this really big aversion to plastics by some people in Montessori, and the idea is like, I mean, at the time that Maria Montessori was practicing, which, we're talking about like mid 20th century, early to mid 20th century, the stuff that she's working, there's not going to be that much plastic, right? Let's get real. Like if you're teaching a classroom in the 1930s or 40s, you're not going to have a ton of stuff even available that's made of plastic. Everything's going to be made of glass or wood or metal, like, so if we're talking about things reflecting the real world, then in our current real world, a lot of stuff is made out of plastic, and a lot of things are plastic based, like in our everyday lives, plastic, silicones, etc. So why would we not also allow our children to play with things that are reflective of the world that they live in, And I think if we were updating Montessori to reflect the current state of affairs, as opposed to seeing it as like a Bible or some sort of inflexible pedagogy, I think people would recognize that, yeah, plastic is okay to play with. And I also, obviously, again, there's so many classed messages going on there, because who can afford these wooden and metal and, glass objects? Okay, anyone, you could argue, because you could get them from Goodwill or IKEA or something, and that's true. But when your child breaks them or colors on them or destroys them, and then you have to buy new stuff, that's not going to be as easily accessible for someone who may be on, the lower end economically, who would much easier go to the dollar store and buy something that's plastic that could be used for the same purposes, and put it in their house, right? So like it already sets up a class divide, which was absolutely not the intention of Maria Montessori when she started Montessori pedagogy. Like, it's like quite the opposite, actually. And so in a lot of ways, much as I've argued in another podcast episode from last year or like the year before, I think, this idea of like who has access to certain things is definitely, it feels intentional to me. And they're trying to, it's kind of strange that they've taken a philosophy that was meant for poor children and children of workers, and instead turned it into this like luxury thing. And so I think the article in kind of focusing on this color choice situation really lays out pretty clearly like how it creates a divide, and how it creates the quote unquote good parent versus the bad parent. And that is deeply connected to class stratification, because they say, okay, well, you're a bad parent if you let your kid play with plastic, and you're a bad parent if you let your kid, color and make a mess. And then you start, asking questions like, well, who has the time or the money to watch their kids' every move, who has nannies to take care of that for them instead of doing it themselves, who has, the money to replace all of these fancy objects when the child breaks them, and who has the maid to clean up the objects. You know what I mean? Like it's just one thing after another. And it very much mirrors, as I said before, kind of Victorian notions of child rearing and Victorian notions of good and evil and all of this stuff. It's just going round and round again, back to square one. And it's unfortunate because it definitely stigmatizes certain forms of parenting that might actually allow the child to be freer and happier, Um, and and as long as, for me, I'm kind of like, as long as they're having a good time and they're learning and they're doing it in a safe way, then I'm here for it. You know what I mean? Like, I I don't understand, and I mean, again, I understand it on a structural level and like a big picture level, but I don't understand it on a personal level, why moms would want to put themselves through more misery and more drama than they already have to deal with in just raising a child, for the sake of having a pretty image to put on social media, or for whatever reason of their, personal beliefs that they have to behave in a certain way or look a certain way while they're rearing their children. It just seems like added pressure that's unnecessary and unhealthy. And again, also one that's very much gendered as well. I talked about that a little bit already, but the fathers, I should say the partners of these women who are expected to maintain a perfect home and a perfect child playroom and all this stuff and all these like bland colors, the male partner here is never expected to do any of that stuff. And if anything, the work is outsourced to another woman to maintain that aesthetic, right? So it's outsourced, as I said before, to a nanny or a maid or like a mother's helper. And in which case, all three of these people are going to be women or girls, teenage girls to women. It's up to the babysitter, often a girl, like a teenage girl, to maintain that cleanliness and maintain that aesthetic, right? And so there are lots of questions raised too about which people does this put more pressure on? And it's always the usual suspects, right? Like it puts more pressure on moms who are already, and other women who are already dealing with immense pressures socially, but especially as a parent. And so I think, just like what I would say, and I'm no expert, so take this with a grain of salt, but, I think that like, you got to do what works best. And when I say what works best, like do what's within your means that you can afford. Don't stress yourself out. First of all, if you don't have a playroom, like it's okay. Because I often see these questions pop up on blogs and stuff where it's like, can I do Montessori if I just live in an apartment, or like whatever? Can I do Montessori in a small space? It's like ridiculously sad to me that people are being told or getting like perceiving that they can't embrace a philosophy to raise their child or to teach their child simply because they don't live in a mansion. You're like, what the heck? Like, this is just wild to me that's been the standard as of late. It's as if they're saying like you can't really adequately parent unless you're rich, and that's deeply unfair and wrong, to be quite frank. So like I see a lot of stuff like that, and I think that there's these sorts of movements, in parenting, and especially social media representations of parenting, are really toxic and dangerous, especially for poor women. And so, like I said, I say, do what works best for you. Do what you can do within your means. You, first of all, manage like the basics, like, is your child fed? Is your child healthy? Is your child, happy? And the basic three things, and then worry about the other stuff as it comes, or not worry about it at all, right? Like there's so many things that you can do that don't involve buying anything, that don't involve, having to have the perfect color this or the perfect color that. Like get a book, get things that your kid likes that's small. It doesn't have to be expensive, and the main thing that your kid is learning from is not just these objects, but from time spent with you, right? So if you're working with your child, if you're sitting and talking to your child, if you're engaging your child, if you're doing things together, right? Like that's more important than anything else that these like fancy rich moms are like pushing you to do or buy or whatever. Like none of that really matters at the end of the day. And ultimately, I think that if we have a moment where we can just take a deep breath, don't worry about what's on social media. It's not real anyway. At least it's not fully representative of the actual experiences of these parents and families, and just breathe. And then say to yourself, but myself too, because I always find myself doing this, is like, is my child happy? Is my child having a good time? Is my child learning in some way from what we're doing? And like, that's not to say that every single thing we're doing has to be some sort of learning lesson, your experience. It doesn't. But there's always going to be, a little something that they learn, especially if they're younger, right? So what are they getting out of this moment that we're spending together? And that to me is way more important, and a lot cheaper than any of the fancy stuff that the parents are expected, and especially mothers are expected to maintain in a household, that I just think is unrealistic, and unfair. And don't worry about if they're playing with plastic toys, or don't worry about if they're, watching a little TV. Like, it's not going to kill them. And so I think that it's just, we have to get out of these boxes that we keep constantly being forced into for the sake of consumer capitalism, because that's ultimately what it's about, right? Like, even though it seems to be more minimal, it seems to be more nature-based or whatever, it's still pushing us into an area where we are not in control of what we're doing as parents, and instead we're like adhering to these systems that tell us to just, you have to buy the right thing, you have to use the right color, you have to buy the right brand of clothes and this sort of aesthetic and this sort of like these sorts of protocols that they have to follow when they make the clothes, or otherwise, like, come on, you might be better off just buying clothes from Goodwill that have been worn before by another kid, or like borrowing clothes from a family member who just had a kid or whatever, instead of just going out and buying brand new stuff just because it's organic or whatever. So, and I also want to say, I should say, like, full disclosure, I'm also not judging moms who do want to adhere to this thing, right? If you can afford to do it and you feel like it works best for you, do your thing. Like, I'm not saying what you're doing is bad, but what I am saying is bad is that society is telling us that there's only one way to parent, and there's only one way. There's a very rigid box that we have to fit into if we want it to be quote unquote good moms, right? And it's all surface, and it's not about, like, very little of this ends up being about how your child feels, and instead it ends up being about what the society that you live in says about what you're doing, and how other moms may judge you for what you're doing and whether or not you meet those standards. So with that said, try to let that go if you are a parent, and if you're listening to this, and really just focus on, like I said, what's making your child happy, what's making you feel balanced as a parent, and what's making your relationship stronger together, as you go through your day to day. So, I think for the next few months, I'm going to keep doing, like, at least try to do a once a week episode, about a variety of different things, whether it's a Comrade Mommy episode, a Reading Revolution episode, a Left POC of the Week episode, whatever it is. I do want to put something out once a week. And I plan on, I'm going to get some interviews lined up and things like that for all different segments of the podcast, or, like, I should say, sub-series of the podcast. And I also would like to do more on pop culture this year, particularly because I've just noticed so much stuff in pop culture lately that has a really, really interesting and important line, or several, on class issues, racial issues, etc., that I think could be really, really good meat for us to chow into for this podcast. Like, I really think we could get a lot out of discussing these things. So look forward to that, because I would like to start talking about some shows and movies and whatnot. And I think also just because, like, during the pandemic, I've always been into pop culture, but during the pandemic, when that started up and as it continues, I've noticed myself watching and consuming a lot of this pop culture stuff in a more, I don't know, in like a heavier way, right? And I think too, just as a parent, like, it's kind of always on in the background or in my headphones or something like that. And also as a way to kind of escape, I guess, just being completely honest with myself. Like, instead of reading all the really difficult, like, science articles, or like watching the news or whatever, and just dealing with that. Sometimes you have to take a break, and I do that through really bad reality TV and stuff. So, but anyway, that being said, I think that there is some room there to discuss some of the class elements of these shows, and sort of the social and political issues that they bring up that perhaps even scripted shows are not as willing to broach, and certainly do a poorer job of. So yeah, we'll be talking about some pop culture stuff too this year, and I'm gonna just embrace that side of myself and stop seeing it as a separate, um, like separate thing from my politics, and recognize it as like a lens or a thing through which I'm viewing these pop culture elements. So I'm gonna embrace that too. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening. And if you can, please like and share and subscribe to the podcast. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your mama, tell your friend, etc. Tell your colleague about Left POC. And also, if you are so inclined, feel free to donate $1 or more per month by going to our Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/leftpoc. I've got to put some things there that to reflect sort of updates on the episodes and whatnot. But generally, I put content there that is useful, and I will certainly be uploading the article that I discussed briefly in this episode and some other stuff. So yeah, feel free to join. And also, I should just say that everything on the Patreon feed is always free. I don't charge because I don't believe that any of this information should be behind a paywall, but I may start doing some special stuff, Q&As or whatever, that are kind of like off the record type things that I do charge for on Patreon, but I don't foresee having many of those, and I feel like we'll eventually release them to the public for free anyway. But if you want to be the one to get it early, that may be something you can do. And also, if you just like what we're doing around here, if you like this project, if you're happy that it exists, and if you want to support people like me who are doing things that are a little bit different, but doing it to, like, I don't know, get the word out on left politics, please feel free to support us for that reason too. And if you can't support, if you don't have $1 or more per month, which is the hardest phrase to say on the earth for me, but if you want to support us in other ways, feel free to do that too. Like I said, share the podcast, tell a friend, share the social media stuff that you see and find interesting from Left POC, and definitely check us out everywhere by simply searching for Left POC. So with that said, thank you all so much for listening. Take care of yourselves, be safe, and also, just as a reminder, if you have to go indoors or if you're going to be in close contact with another human being outdoors, please, 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 I beg of you, wear a mask, and wear a good mask. Wear an N95, a KN95, or a KF94 that fits you well, and don't take it off while you're indoors, because you're breathing in dirty COVID air. So we don't want you to get sick, and we don't want other folks to get sick through you. So do your best to lower the spread, to fight all of that back by wearing a mask. It's really simple. And if you are so inclined, which I also encourage, get vaccinated, but do more than one thing, right? It's like all hands on deck here. Do everything you can to reduce the spread, to reduce infection, and, reduce getting this as well. Prevent. Okay, folks, have a good one. Be safe. Peace out. Bye.